They thought they knew her story. They had no idea what those scars really meant. The cruel laughter echoed through Mel's diner as Sarah Martinez served another table, her long sleeves hiding the scars that made her a target. But when a stranger noticed the faded tattoo on her wrist, everything was about to change. Some heroes don't wear capes, they wear aprons. The neon sign of Mel's Diner flickered against the gray Nebraska sky, casting intermittent red light across the cracked parking lot. Inside, the familiar symphony of clinking plates and sizzling grease filled the air. Worn vinyl booths lined the windows, their tiers patched with duct tape, while the black and white checkered floor bore the scuff marks of countless work boots and sneakers. The coffee was strong, the pie was homemade, and the atmosphere was pure small-town America, except for the tension that settled over table 6 every Tuesday night. Sarah Martinez moved between tables with practiced precision, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her uniform crisp despite the dinner rush. At 28, she carried herself with quiet dignity, but there was something guarded in her brown eyes, something that spoke of experiences far beyond the walls of this small-town diner. 3 years ago, she had been Staff Sergeant Martinez, a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne Division. 2 tours in Afghanistan had ended abruptly when an IED explosion changed everything. The blast had left its marked burns across her arms and torso, scars that she now kept hidden beneath long sleeves, even in the sweltering heat of the kitchen. The Army had given her medals Bronze Star with Valor Purple Heart Combat Medical Badge. The VA had given her disability payments and therapy sessions. But neither could give her back the confidence. She'd lost the sense of purpose that had defined her for so long. Now she worked the evening shift at Mel's, saving every dollar for nursing school, trying to rebuild a life from the fragments of who she used to be. Most customers treated her with the casual politeness reserved for service workers. But not everyone. Not the group that had made her their favorite target. Rick Paulson and his crew of 4 local contractors had discovered her scars 3 months ago during a particularly busy night when she'd rolled up her sleeves. Since then, they'd made it their mission to remind her of what they saw as her damage. Every Tuesday, they claimed the back corner booth, ordering the cheapest items and leaving the smallest tips, all while subjecting Sarah to a steady stream of cruel comments about her appearance. Frankenstein, they called her, damaged goods. The management knew the other customers saw it, but nobody intervened. Sarah endured it because she needed the job, because she couldn't afford to start over again. This Tuesday felt different from the moment Sarah clocked in. The autumn air carried a chill that seemed to seep through the diner's windows, and she found herself checking the clock more frequently than usual. At 6:30 p.m., the familiar sound of loud voices announced Rick's arrival. He strutted through the door with his usual entourage, their work boots heavy on the checkered floor. "Well, well," Rick announced loudly enough for the entire diner to hear. "Look who's working tonight, our favorite war casualty." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest, but forced herself to approach their table with menus. This was her test, her daily battle to prove she could handle whatever they threw at her. She'd survived roadside bombs and enemy fire. She could survive Rick Paulson's cruelty. "Evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice steady. "What can I get you to drink?" "Depends." Rick leaned back with a smirk. "You gonna tell us how you got so messed up? Come on, share the story." We're all dying to know what happened to our local freak show. Sarah had developed strategies over the months. Keep interactions brief. Don't make eye contact. Focus on the work. Remember that their words said more about them than about her. She'd learned these techniques in therapy, along with breathing exercises and grounding methods to prevent panic attacks. "I'll give you a minute to look at the menu," she replied, turning away before Rick could respond. In the kitchen, Mel looked up from the grill. The 60-year-old owner had hired Sarah, despite her obvious struggles with crowds and sudden noises. He'd been patient with her panic attacks, understanding about her therapy appointments, and protective in his own gruff way. "Those idiots bothering you again?" he asked. "Nothing I can't handle," Sarah lied, though her hands trembled as she filled water glasses. "You know I could ban them. This is my place." Sarah shook her head. "I won't let them chase me away from another job." This was her third position since leaving the Army. The first two hadn't worked out panic attacks, conflicts with customers who didn't understand PTSD. She needed this to work. She needed to prove she could build something new. When she returned to their table, Rick had his phone out recording. "Hey, Facebook friends," he said loudly, "check out our local war hero. Tell them about your scars, Sarah. Tell them how tough you used to be before you got all broken." The other customers began to stare. Sarah felt the walls closing in, the familiar symptoms building: rapid heartbeat, shallow breathing, the sensation that she was back in that burning vehicle in Afghanistan. She closed her eyes for a moment, using the breathing techniques Dr. Peterson had taught her. "I need your order," she said quietly. "What's that speak up, soldier girl? Use that command voice you probably had over there." Sarah's jaw tightened. She thought about the soldiers she'd saved, the lives she'd held in her hands, the moment she'd crawled into that burning Humvee to pull out a wounded sergeant. These men knew nothing about courage, nothing about sacrifice, nothing about the weight of carrying others' lives in your hands. But she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of breaking her. Not tonight. Not ever. "I'll come back when you're ready to order," she said, walking away as Rick's laughter echoed behind her. The harassment escalated throughout the evening. Rick and his friends ordered the cheapest items, then complained about everything. The coffee was too hot, the service too slow, Sarah's attitude too uppity. Each interaction was designed to chip away at her composure, to remind her of her place in their twisted hierarchy. "You know what your problem is," Rick said during one visit to refill their coffee. "You think you're better than us because you played soldier. But look at you now, just another broken-down waitress with a bad attitude and ugly scars." Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she poured, but she said nothing. Around the diner, other customers shifted uncomfortably. An elderly couple whispered to each other, clearly disturbed. A trucker at the counter shook his head, but didn't intervene. The unspoken rule seemed to be that this was Sarah's problem to handle alone. By 7 p.m., the dinner rush was in full swing. Sarah found herself grateful for the distraction of busy tables and complex orders. She moved with military precision, taking orders, delivering food, managing multiple tables simultaneously. The skills she'd learned in the Army, staying calm under pressure, multitasking, maintaining focus despite chaos, served her well in the restaurant environment. At table 12, a man in his 50s sat alone, nursing a cup of coffee and reading a newspaper. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, but there was something about his posture, straight-backed, alert, that suggested military bearing. His graying hair was cut short, and his weathered hands bore the calluses of honest work. Michael Kelly had come to Mel's for a quiet dinner after a long day at the construction site. He was new to town, having moved here 6 months ago to be closer to his aging parents. As a 20-year Army veteran himself, he recognized the signs of PTSD in Sarah's careful movements, her hypervigilance, the way she positioned herself to always have a clear view of exits. But it was Rick's behavior that really caught his attention. Michael had seen bullies before in the military and civilian life, and he recognized the particular cruelty of someone who targeted the vulnerable. His jaw tightened with each cruel comment, his newspaper forgotten, as he watched the scene unfold. When Rick's voice rose again, "Maybe if you smiled more, people wouldn't notice how messed up you look." Michael slowly folded his newspaper and prepared to intervene. But something made him pause. As Sarah passed his table, he caught a glimpse of her left forearm, where her sleeve had ridden up slightly. There, partially visible beneath the fabric, was the unmistakable outline of a military tattoo. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He'd seen that particular design before, the distinctive insignia of the ADA 2nd Airborne Division combined with the Medical Corps symbol. It was a combination he'd never forget, because it belonged to the person who had saved his life. Afghanistan, 2019. Forward Operating Base, Chapman. The memory hit him like a physical blow. The convoy, the IED, the burning vehicle. The combat medic who had crawled into the flames to pull him to safety, taking shrapnel from a secondary explosion in the process. He'd been unconscious for most of it, but he'd heard the story later from his squad mates. A female medic, they'd said, brave as hell, got hurt, saving his life. He'd tried to find her afterward to thank her properly, but she'd been evacuated to Germany for treatment and then discharged before he could track her down. All he'd known was her last name, Martinez, and that she'd received the Bronze Star with Valor for her actions that day. Could it really be her? After all these years in this small Nebraska town, Michael studied Sarah's face more carefully, looking past the scar that traced from her temple to her jaw, past the careful mask of professional composure. There, in the set of her shoulders, the way she moved with purpose, despite the harassment, he saw the soldier who had saved his life. Michael's heart raced as the pieces fell into place. The timing was right. She would have been discharged around 2020, giving her time to struggle with civilian life before ending up here. The scars matched what he'd heard about her injuries. And that tattoo. He'd never seen another medic with that exact combination of unit insignia. He needed to be sure, but he also needed to act. Rick's harassment was escalating, and Sarah was clearly reaching her breaking point. Her breathing had become shallow, her movements more rigid. Michael recognized the signs of an impending panic attack as Rick launched into another cruel tirade. "I bet they discharged you because you couldn't handle the pressure. Probably cracked up over there, right? That's what happens to the weak ones." Michael made his decision. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. The sound cut through Rick's laughter, drawing attention from across the diner. Michael was a big man, 6'2", with broad shoulders and hands scarred from years of construction work. When he moved with purpose, people noticed. "That's enough," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Rick looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "Excuse me, old man. I said that's enough. You're going to apologize to the lady and then you're going to leave. The confrontation Sarah had been dreading was finally here. Rick laughed, but there was less confidence in it now. The entire diner had gone quiet, all attention focused on the confrontation unfolding in the back corner. And who's going to make me you? Michael didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked directly at Sarah, his eyes moving to her forearm where the sleeve had ridden up during her work. "Ma'am," he said, his voice suddenly gentle, "could you show me your left arm?" Sarah stared at him in confusion, her heart pounding from the adrenaline of the confrontation. "I'm sorry. Your tattoo, the one on your forearm. Could you show it to me, please?" Something in his tone, respectful, urgent, almost reverent, made her comply. With trembling hands, she rolled up her sleeve, revealing the full tattoo. The distinctive wings of the 8th Alaskan Airborne Division intertwined with the Medical Corps Caduceus, along with her unit designation and the dates of her service. Michael stared at the tattoo for a long moment, his eyes filling with tears. Around the diner, customers leaned forward, sensing that something momentous was happening, but not understanding what. "Jesus Christ," Michael whispered. "You're her. You're really her." Rick and his friends had stopped their snickering, confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere. The cruel confidence that had carried them through months of harassment began to evaporate as they realized they were witnessing something beyond their understanding. "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael took a step closer, his hands shaking. "Afghanistan, 2019, Forward Operating Base Chapman, March 15th. Do you remember?" The date hit Sarah like a physical blow. Forb Chapman, March 15th, 2019, the day that changed everything. The memories came flooding back, the emergency call during lunch, the race to the convoy site, the scene of devastation they'd found. 3 vehicles destroyed, multiple casualties, and in the middle of it all, a soldier trapped in a burning Humvee. "You probably don't remember me," Michael continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I remember you. I was Sergeant First Class Kelly, then 3rd Infantry Division. Our convoy hit an IED about 2 clicks from the base. I was trapped in the vehicle, bleeding out, when you and your team arrived." Sarah's legs went weak. She remembered now the soldier in the burning vehicle, unconscious and critically injured. The flames had been too intense for the standard extraction protocols. Everyone had said it was too dangerous, that they should wait for the fire suppression team. But there hadn't been time. The fuel tank was compromised, secondary explosions were imminent, and the soldier was dying. "The vehicle was on fire," Michael said, his voice carrying across the silent diner. "Everyone else said it was too dangerous, that we should wait. But you didn't wait. You crawled into that burning vehicle and pulled me out with your bare hands." Rick's face had gone pale. Around the diner, customers sat frozen, beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were witnessing. "That's impossible," Rick said weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. "She's just a waitress. She's nothing special." Michael turned to face Rick, and for the first time since entering the diner, his voice carried an edge of pure fury. "Nothing special. This woman crawled into a burning vehicle to save my life. She dragged me to safety while taking shrapnel from a secondary explosion. Those scars you've been making fun of, she got them saving my life and the lives of 3 other soldiers." Sarah's hands were shaking uncontrollably now, not from fear, but from the overwhelming rush of memories and emotions. She remembered the heat, the smoke, the weight of the unconscious soldier as she dragged him from the wreckage. She remembered the moment when the fuel tank had exploded, sending metal fragments tearing through her arms and torso. She remembered waking up in the field hospital 3 days later, more concerned about her patients than her own injuries. You received the Bronze Star with valor for that action. Michael continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. And the Purple Heart for the wounds you sustained. But more than that, his voice broke slightly. You gave me the chance to come home to my family. My daughter graduated high school last month. My son just started college. I've been married for 25 years, and I got to celebrate our anniversary because of what you did. The silence in the diner was absolute. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every eye in the room. Rick and his friends sat frozen, their earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of this revelation. I've been looking for you for years, Michael said, turning back to Sarah. I wanted to thank you properly. The transformation in the diner's atmosphere was immediate and complete. Where moments before there had been uncomfortable tolerance of Rick's cruelty, now there was palpable hostility directed at him and his friends. Customers who had remained silent for months now stared at them with undisguised disgust. Michael continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the restaurant. I wrote letters to the Army, tried to track you down through veteran organizations. I never imagined I'd find you here in my hometown being treated like this by these people. He spat the last word with such contempt that Rick actually flinched. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, struggling to process what was happening. For 3 years, she'd carried the weight of her service in silence, believing that her scars marked her as broken, damaged, less than whole. She'd internalized the shame that people like Rick had heaped upon her, accepting their narrative that she was somehow diminished by what she'd been through. But seeing herself through Michael's eyes as a hero, as someone worthy of respect and gratitude, was reshaping everything she thought she knew about herself. The woman who had been cowering under Rick's abuse just minutes earlier now stood straighter, her shoulders back, her military bearing becoming visible for the first time in years. I didn't know. Rick stammered, his face cycling through shades of red and white as the full weight of Michael's words sank in. His friends were already sliding out of the booth, eager to escape the uncomfortable situation. You didn't want to know, Michael replied coldly. You saw someone you thought was weak, someone you could hurt without consequences, and you decided to make her your target. You never bothered to learn who she really was. Rick looked around the diner, desperately searching for any sign of support, but found only hostile faces. The elderly woman at table 6 stood up slowly. I want to apologize, she said to Sarah. I should have done more to stop this earlier. Thank you for your service. One by one, other customers began to stand, a wave of support that had been building for months, finally finding its voice. The moment hung in the air like a held breath. Sarah felt the weight of the entire diner's attention, the mixture of shame, gratitude, and newfound respect from people who had watched her suffer in silence. Her heart pounded as she realized that everything was about to change, not just for tonight, but forever. Rick made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. This is ridiculous, he said, but his voice cracked. I was just joking around. She never said she was in the military. How was I supposed to know? The words hung in the air, highlighting the fundamental cruelty of his logic that it was somehow acceptable to torment someone as long as you didn't know their full story. Sarah found her voice at last, and when she spoke, it carried the authority she'd tried so hard to suppress. "I shouldn't have had to tell you," she said, looking directly at Rick. "Even if I hadn't served, even if I was just a civilian with scars from an accident or illness, what you did was cruel and wrong." Her voice grew stronger, with each word the military bearing that she'd hidden for 3 years, finally emerging. "But since you want to know, yes, I'm a combat veteran. Yes, I'm a decorated soldier. Yes, I saved lives, and I'd do it again without hesitation. These scars aren't marks of shame. They're proof that I was willing to sacrifice everything for people I'd never met, people who needed help." The transformation was remarkable. The woman who had been their victim was revealing herself to be everything they were not: brave, selfless, honorable. Michael stepped forward, his voice filled with pride. This woman received the Bronze Star with Valor, the Purple Heart, and the Combat Medical Badge. She served 2 tours in Afghanistan, saving countless lives. The day she saved me, she also pulled 3 other soldiers from burning vehicles. She single-handedly prevented what could have been a massacre. He turned to address the entire diner. "While you've been sitting here watching her get bullied, she's been working double shifts to put herself through nursing school. She's been volunteering at the VA hospital on weekends, helping other veterans adjust to civilian life. She's been everything this community should be proud of, and instead, you've let these cowards make her life hell." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could see the shame on the faces of customers who had witnessed Rick's harassment and done nothing. She could see the dawning realization that they had all failed her, that their silence had been complicity. But she could also see something else: respect, gratitude, and the beginning of understanding. For the first time in 3 years, she felt truly seen for who she was, rather than what had happened to her. Mel emerged from the kitchen, having heard the entire exchange. His weathered face was dark with anger as he looked at Rick and his friends. "You're banned," he said simply. "All of you, permanently. And if I hear about you bothering Sarah anywhere else in this town, you'll answer to me and every other decent person who heard what happened here tonight." The trucker at the counter stood up, his massive frame imposing. "That goes for all of us," he said. "This lady's a hero, and she deserves better than what you've given her." One by one, other customers voiced their agreement. The wave of support that had been building finally crested, washing away months of accumulated shame and humiliation. Sarah stood in the middle of it all, tears streaming down her face, finally understanding that she didn't have to carry her burdens alone. Rick and his friends shuffled toward the door, their earlier swagger completely gone. As they reached the exit, Rick turned back one last time. "I really didn't know," he said, and for the first time he sounded genuinely remorseful. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. "That's the problem, Rick. You never bothered to find out." The diner erupted in spontaneous applause as Rick and his friends disappeared into the night. Sarah stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of support from people who had been strangers just hours before. Customers approached her table by table, thanking her for her service, apologizing for their silence, asking about her experiences with genuine interest and respect. The tips that night were the best she'd ever received, but more importantly, she felt valued and seen in a way she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. Michael stayed until closing time, sharing stories of his recovery and his family expressing gratitude that could never fully be repaid. He gave her his contact information and promised to help her connect with other veterans in the area. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah drove home without the weight of dread about tomorrow's shift. The knot of anxiety that had lived in her chest for so long had finally begun to loosen. The story of what happened at Mel's Diner spread through the small Nebraska town like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone knew about Sarah Martinez and her heroic service. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the decorated veteran who had been hiding in plain sight. Rick Paulson found himself ostracized by the community, his construction business losing contracts as word spread about his treatment of a war hero. Within a month, Sarah had enrolled in an accelerated nursing program, her tuition covered by a scholarship fund established by grateful community members. She continued working at Mel's part-time, but now she wore short sleeves with pride, her scars visible reminders of her courage rather than sources of shame. The diner became an unofficial gathering place for veterans in the area, creating a support network that hadn't existed before. 6 months later, Sarah stood before a graduating class of nursing students, delivering the commencement address. Her scars were clearly visible in her cap and gown, but she wore them like badges of honor. In the audience, Michael Kelly sat with his family, beaming with pride at the woman who had saved his life and was now saving others in a different way. "Your scars tell your story," Sarah told the graduates, her voice strong and clear. "Don't let anyone else write the ending." The girl who had once hidden in shame had become a beacon of hope, proving that true strength isn't in hiding your wounds, but in transforming them into wisdom and purpose.